Kia ora everyone, kia ora katoa, welcome. My name is Angus, I'm an executive member of the Wellington Socialist Society. Just a little bit of housekeeping, I guess, before we get underway. Wellington Socialist Society has not been here really to talk here, but if you haven't before, we are primarily an educational organisation, hosting talks roughly monthly up here at Bedlam Scholar most of the time. And we're part of the New Zealand Federation of Socialist Societies. We have sister organisations in Canterbury and in Otago. We have a little bit of collateral, so there's stickers around, feel free to take a sticker. And we have our magazine, our publication, The Commonweal, at the back there, which incidentally runs the editor of. There's some sign-up sheets as well if you'd like to get on our mailing list or hear a bit more about membership. If you want to talk to someone about membership here tonight, then me or there's other people milling around that are helping, feel free to grab us and have a chat. But I think we'll just crack on with it, eh? So our talk tonight on James Connolly, and I'm getting the actual title of the talk, right? So, what was the actual title of the talk?
I don't know, you're asking. Irish Nationalist and Revolutionary Socialist.
There you go. Yeah. James Connolly, Irish Nationalist, Revolutionary Socialist. So, I got to admit, I don't know a hell of a lot about James Connolly beyond his involvement in the 1916 Easter Rising. And as such, I made a bit of a point of going to visit the focal point of the Easter Rising, the General Post Office in Dublin when I was there a few years ago. Connolly, of course, paid the ultimate price for his involvement in that rebellion, executed along with 15 other Republican prisoners. But I have been thinking about a quote, and I think we use this quote to kind of advertise this talk, and I think you might have this early on your slides too. And that's this here. If you remove the English army and hoist the green flag over Dublin Castle, unless you set about organising the organisation of a Socialist Republic, your efforts will be in vain. England will still rule you. She will still rule you through her capitalists, through her landlords, through her financiers, through the whole array of commercial and individualist institutions she has planted in this country and watered with the tears of our martyrs, or the tears of our mothers and the blood of our martyrs. I think that's a pretty powerful quote, at least in my opinion. Partly because it's as true today as it was when Connolly said it over 100 years ago. The role of the 20th century notwithstanding. But it's been brought into focus even more clearly by recent events, I think. Today, when you consider that we have both a resurgence in national liberation struggles and nation-building projects in places like Palestine, Francophone Africa, and South America, as well as chauvinist and revanchist nationalist projects in the US, and Russia, and European states like Hungary. And of course, in Aotearoa, where Māori and Tēnatanga activists are leading the struggle not just against the current government, but for the reimagining of New Zealand society as we know it. So as socialists, how do we relate to these questions? Socialist conversations on the national question often take positions from the Third International period as their starting point. And indeed, Joseph Stalin's main theoretical contribution to Marxism was arguably his 1913 pamphlet, Marxism and the National Question. Trotskyists, anarchists, and libertarian socialists often then frame their positions in opposition to this. So I'm looking forward tonight to hearing about what how socialists from an earlier period related to the open question of nationalism and socialism, what they thought the important considerations were, and what we can learn from this, what we can learn for our struggles today. So, without further ado, introduce Martin. Martin, member of the Canterbury Socialist Society Executive, as I say, editor of Commonweal, historian, and rugby league fanatic. Thanks, Martin.
Hi, it's good to be here. After a few hiccups on the way, the plane got halfway to Wellington, then turned around and went back to Christchurch. But luckily I managed to get on another one fairly quickly, otherwise this might not be happening at all. And the quote that you just heard, there it is in red on the screen behind you, so you did your research well. Okay. According to Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm, William Morris and James Connolly made the only really interesting and original contributions to Marxism in Great Britain. Those of you who were here for the inaugural lecture of the of the Wellington Socialist Society will remember me talking about Morris, saying that he was in many ways a hero to me. So that connection alone, Morris and Connolly, is one reason why I got interested in Connolly. Then there's the fact that Connolly is the only British Marxist to actually attempt a revolution as opposed to talking about one. Arthur McManus, inaugural president of the Communist Party of Great Britain, said that Jim Connolly was the first socialist I had met who actually worked for the revolution and dreamt of its immediate possibility. That, and his death at the hands of a British firing squad after the Easter Rising of 1916, make him a heroic and a romantic figure. What a story. But when I began to read about Connolly many years ago, I realised that there was more than one story. As Sean Harkin has pointed out, Connolly is one of the most well-known, most revered and often most misrepresented characters in Irish history. There's the rebel wrapped in a green flag, a nationalist icon, with hospitals, stations and streets named after him. There's the Irish Lenin, as described by the likes of C. Desmond Greaves, a hero of the working class. And then we've got the James Connolly who's been criticised by such as Kieran Allen of the Socialist Workers' Party for his theoretical shortcomings. I reference Allen several times. I don't agree with all of his analysis, but I do recommend his book for its focus on Connolly's politics. And then there's Connolly the fanatic, described by an ex-IRA man turned informer, Sean O'Callaghan, as demonstrating the ugly sentimentality of the true absolutist. He lived a life without joy, he says O'Callaghan. Quoting Connolly, "As long as I live, I will have no rest, only working, educating, organising and fighting to destroy the forces that produce poverty. This," he argues, "is ugly, sad and empty of what it is to be truly human." I beg to differ, and I hope by the end of my talk you might beg to differ as well. But the splintering of Connolly's politics has been expressed in music, in poetry, and a host of other ways. Best expressed by two ballads, I think, dedicated to his name. In one, he's the brave son of Ireland, and in other, he's the hero of the Irish working class. And later, if the technology works, and that's always a bit iffy, but I have a capable assistant over there, I'll play clips from both of those songs. But what is important is that those two ballads epitomise the way in which Connolly is seen as living in two rather contradictory worlds. Socialism, after all, is international. If we are a socialist, we are an internationalist. And then he was also heavily enmeshed in the militant nationalism of the Irish independence movement. And as he said shortly before his death, awaiting execution, they, and by that he meant his fellow socialists, they will never understand why I'm here. So why was James Connolly, revolutionary international socialist, to be found inside the Dublin General Post Office, fighting alongside nationalist rebels against the might of the British Empire? Connolly was born on the 5th of June 1868 in Edinburgh. His parents, refugees from the Great Hunger in Ireland of 1845 to 51. His early life, like so many other Irish refugees, was one of terrible poverty, living as he did in the little island of the Cowgate slum in Edinburgh. And this background is essential for understanding his socialist trajectory and beliefs. He left school at 11 to work as a baker's apprentice, but at 14 he lied about his age and used a pseudonym to enlist in the British Army, which was a common escape route for many poor Irishmen. And he served for seven years in the British Army from 1882, and much of his service was spent in Ireland, where he met his wife, Lily Reynolds. He deserted several months before the end of his contract, probably because he didn't want to be sent to India and thus separated from Lily. And he never spoke about his military service, nor did he write about it directly. Probably because he feared punishment, he was after all a deserter, or maybe because he thought it would undercut his credibility amongst working class Irish nationalists. There was also the worry, he thought, that being born and brought up in Scotland might count against him. But given the extent of the Irish diaspora in the 19th century, that's unlikely. And one historian, Lorcan Collins, has said, well, if a cat had kittens in the oven, you wouldn't call them cakes. So, clearly his military service did have an impact upon him. And in an article he wrote in 1899 entitled Soldiers of the Queen, he described soldiers as hired assassins whose first duty is to obey. Having deserted from the army, he returned to Scotland, firstly to Dundee, where he joined William Morris's Socialist League in April 1889, another connection for me there, and then returned to Edinburgh, where he was employed by the City Council as a carter, and he joined the local branch of the Scottish Socialist Federation, attended their study groups and read Marx, Engels and William Morris, and for the rest of his life all of his writings were infused with the basic tenets of Marxism. The two major issues of socialism, class struggle and international solidarity, became the focus of his life's work. He was active in the trade union movement and in 1894 stood in the municipal elections, where he polled 14% of the votes in the St Giles ward. Liberals and Tories, he argued, were the two sections of the same party, the party of property, and socialists should stand in elections to expose them and to encourage resistance. If he was elected, he told voters, it would be to act as a disturber of the political peace, not to manage the system in pursuit of piecemeal reform. But of most interest was his appeal to Irish voters. Perhaps they will learn, he said, how foolish it is to denounce tyranny in Ireland and then to vote for tyrants and the instruments of tyrants at their own door. Landlords in Ireland and England are brethren in fact and indeed. In 1896, James was invited to become the organiser for the Dublin Socialist Society. He arrived in April and the following month launched the Irish Socialist Republican Party. Its membership card was emerald green and it was imprinted with the slogan of the French revolutionary Camille Desmoulins. The great appear to be great because we are on our knees. Let us rise. The party's manifesto declared its aim to be the establishment of an Irish Socialist Republic based upon the public ownership of land and the instruments of production, distribution and exchange. Connolly viewed the two struggles for national self-determination and socialism as complementary. He thought that a struggle for independence, a popular struggle for independence, could spill over into a working class struggle for socialism, and his role therefore was to make socialists. Just to divert a little bit to talk about what Marx and Engels had to say about Irish independence. Marx wrote in 1870 that for English workers the national emancipation of Ireland is no question of abstract justice or humanitarian sentiment, but the first condition of their own social emancipation. He pointed out how the landed aristocracy in England got much of their wealth from their Irish estates. But meanwhile, mass Irish immigration to England had fostered two hostile camps within the working class, leaving the English prey to chauvinism and subservient to the dominant ideology of the Liberals and Tories. And of course, any students of history will know that that is the commonplace of history, that you give those at the bottom of the heap somebody below them to resent for taking their jobs, for taking their houses, a common theme in Aotearoa today. And Marx and Engels' concern, however, was the political development of the English working class. For they suggested this antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the working class, despite its organisation. It's the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power. And Engels argued that there was no prospect of a purely socialist movement in Ireland for some considerable time, due to its colonial status, its economic underdevelopment, and the lack of a mass working class. But he said, this should not prevent us from seeking to help them to get rid of their landlords, that is, to pass from semi-feudal conditions to capitalist conditions. This is the classic stages argument of Second International Socialism. So the Second International, from about 1870 through to the establishment of the Third International in 1919 after the Russian Revolution, firmly believed in this sort of mechanistic theory of revolution, that society had to pass through certain economic stages and you couldn't rush the process. So just as it had moved from feudalism to capitalism, so eventually you will move from capitalism on to socialism. You cannot accelerate that process. Connolly's perspective was radically different. He was concerned to politicise the Irish working class, and he was the first socialist not only to support the independence struggle, but to look how it could tie in with the fight against capitalism. In 1897, that phrase that was on the first slide, you can leave that up, it's fine, summed that up beautifully. If you just have a struggle for independence and you overthrow the British Empire and establish an Irish ruling class made up of the current businessmen, industrialists and financiers, you will not achieve independence for the working class. You will not achieve freedom from poverty for the working class. Okay? Because the interest of the Irish bourgeoisie, he would say, are intimately connected to the interest of the British ruling class. But in the late 19th century, the northeast of Ireland was industrialising rapidly, as was Dublin, with an increasingly combative working class. And this coincided with a broad political and cultural movement developing in the south, centred around the revival of the Gaelic language, art and sports. Connolly set out to win over advanced nationalists and republicans to a strategy of rejecting class alliances and supporting a socialist workers' republic. The ISRP held weekly open-air meetings combined with political study groups. At this time, Connolly was opposed to the physical force tradition of Irish nationalism. So anybody who knows anything about Irish politics will know there's been a long sort of stream of uprisings against the British Empire, dating way back to the 17th century. Connolly opposed that at this time, but on purely tactical and not pacifist grounds. In keeping with the dominant approach of Marxist parties across the world at that time, he urged Republicans to form a political party to contest elections, using the revolutionary ballot to seize power. But he understood that a struggle beyond electoralism would be necessary. If a socialist government with majority support was blocked by a possessing class entrenched behind the barriers of law and order, then force would be justified. And again, we can see numerous examples throughout history. Just take Chile, where a socialist government gets elected under Allende. What happens? The military, supported by the middle classes and the ruling classes, overthrew that, and Allende was executed. So he was a revolutionary. He was fiercely critical of any efforts to reform capitalism. He was against simply something which was the state ownership of the economy that did not equate with his vision of socialism. The state, he said, is simply the coercive forces of capitalist society. State ownership and control is not necessarily socialism. If it were, then the army, the navy, the police, the judges, the jailers, the informers and the hangman all would be socialist functionaries. But the ownership by the state of all the land and materials for labour, combined with the cooperative control by the workers of such land and materials, would be socialism. Here we see members of the Irish Socialist Republican Party in a park in Dublin, and a journalist reporting their party meetings commented that the time of the party there was more syllables than the party had members. Nevertheless, it is of seminal importance. It was the first Socialist and Republican Party in Ireland. It produced the first socialist newspaper, the Workers' Republic. It was ahead of its times in calling for an independent republic, and it was the forerunner and the ideological springboard for a political tradition that eventually would have a significant impact upon Irish politics. In 1897, the party set up rank-and-file 98 committees to prepare for the 100th anniversary celebrations of the United Irishmen Rising the following year. That rising had been led by Wolfe Tone, a Protestant who also espoused religious and class unity in the Irish cause. The committees first of all organised demonstrations against the celebrations of Queen Victoria's Jubilee, protesting against any celebrations for the famine Queen, the Queen that they held responsible for the Irish famine in the mid-19th century. A crowd of 6,000 marched through Dublin under the banner "Down with the Monarchy and Long Live the Public," carrying black flags with the number of famine dead and evicted, and a coffin emblazoned with the words British Empire. The procession was attacked by police, 200 were hospitalised, and Connolly was thrown into prison. The Home Rule Party, that is the party that wanted representation within the British Parliament for Ireland, largely composed of landowners and businessmen, were alarmed by this evidence of popular support for the socialists and for the extreme nationalists, infiltrated the committees and took them over. leading Connolly to comment that they were making a mockery of the revolutionary non-sectarianism of the United Irishmen. Writing of Wolfe Tone in the first edition of the Workers' Republic in August 1898, he said that apostles of freedom are ever idolised when dead, but crucified when living. And those who now idolise Wolfe Tone, were he alive today, would repudiate him as a dangerous malcontent. A very prescient foretelling of James Connolly's own fate. Kieran Allen, who I mentioned earlier, has criticised Connolly for failing to challenge nationalist politics at this time, for failing to maintain political independence, for not seeing the middle-class roots of Republican politics. But this ignores the very real difficulties faced by socialists in Ireland, both then and later, in confronting a deeply rooted nationalist tradition in Irish politics. And no other socialist in the colonies had come anywhere near to grappling with the difficult problem of the relationship between socialists and revolutionary nationalists. Like many socialist parties at the time, the ISRP was plagued by financial problems. And in 1902, Connolly was invited to America by Daniel de Leon, the leader of the Socialist Labour Party there, to undertake a fundraising tour. De Leon's motives were slightly suspect. He wanted to attract Irish workers in the USA to the Socialist Labour Party, but Connolly was impressed by what he saw as the uncompromising nature of the SLP. And upon his return to Ireland, he also visited Scotland, where he helped to form a Socialist Labour Party and briefly acted as its organiser. That party was equally tiny, 80 members or at most. But said Connolly, I firmly believe that the revolutionary movement will always be numerically weak until the hour of revolution arrives. And then it would be easy to get adherents by the thousand, as it is now to get single individuals. Disillusioned by his progress in Ireland, he returned to America in the autumn of 1903, where he first of all got a job at the vast Singer sewing machine factory in Newark. And he joined the SLP. But he soon became alarmed at what he saw as the deep-rooted sectarianism of the party, stemming from the flawed theories of its leader. De Leon's was a highly mechanical theory of Marxism, based on a crude materialist reading. Socialism, he said, was dependent upon the laws of science, and the role of the political party was simply to illuminate those laws. Human intervention had little role to play. Same mechanistic stages theory of Second International Socialism. There was no notion that fighting for reforms might give workers confidence, might lead them to draw lessons and revolutionary conclusions. Moreover, de Leon was highly authoritarian. Connolly, however, took a more classical Marxist stance that a capitalist purchases the labour power of the worker, which is determined by two elements: its physical limits and its satisfaction of certain wants and needs. Trade unions, he said, have a crucial role to play in influencing this and could make temporary gains. These are worthwhile, and the Socialist Party should lead these struggles. On one issue, however, Connolly was less advanced than de Leon, and this was the issue of religion. And of course, coming from a very heavily Catholic Ireland, this is something that plagued him throughout his revolutionary activities. Socialism, he argued, was primarily concerned with economic issues. Other matters would be beyond its scope and would still be there to be contested in a socialist future. Religion posed a particularly challenging issue for him because of that strong popular connection between Catholicism and Irish identity. The ISRP had been regularly attacked from the pulpit, with those voting socialists threatened with excommunication. Worried that they would be cut off from working class audiences if they were successfully caricatured as anti-religious and atheist, he tried to ban discussions of theological matters at meetings. Although in one pamphlet, Labour, Nationality and Religion, he tried to expose the Church's hypocrisy, and he defended Marx's materialist approach to history. But he also tried to draw out the egalitarian themes of early Christianity and link them with socialism. So there is, of course, this tradition in some socialist circles of Jesus Christ the Socialist, and Connolly tried to draw that element of socialism out. Increasingly disillusioned with the Socialist Labour Party, Connolly was inspired by the birth of the industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies, in 1905. The Wobblies' roots lay in the militancy of the Western Federation of Miners, and its disgust with the American Federation of Labour, which focused on benefit funds rather than struggle, and was anti-immigrant, racist and anti-female workers. The IWW espoused one big union, industrial organisation as the only way to combat the growing concentration of capital, and direct action, i.e. syndicalism, the destruction of capitalism through revolutionary industrial struggle. Very influential in New Zealand between about 1908 and 1912-13, the IWW. In Socialism Made Easy in 1908, which has been quoted as a marvellous piece of propaganda and his first successful publication, he made the case for syndicalism. As political parties are the reflex of economic conditions, he said, it follows that industrial unity, once established, will create the political unity of the working class. Political division is born of industrial division. Political scabbery is born of industrial craft scabbing. Political weakness keeps even step with industrial weakness. The aim, he said, was to build up an industrial republic inside the shell of the political state, so that it can crack the shell of that state and step into its place. Connolly's socialism was always democratic, but he now saw it as operating through mass participation in the workplace, but he never repudiated the need for a socialist political party. That would be the political expression, he said, of the fight in the workplace, to educate the working class until full political consciousness and industrial unity was achieved. Increasingly at odds with De Leon, who even accused him of being a Jesuit spy, Connolly became organiser of the New York District Council of the Wobblies in 1907 and eventually left the SLP in 1908. The year before, he edited Songs of Freedom by Irish authors. No revolutionary movement is complete without its poetical expression. Until the movement is marked by the joyous, defiant singing of revolutionary songs, it lacks one of the most distinctive marks of a popular revolutionary movement. Anybody who knows anything about the industrial workers of the world, of course, will know that they were very big on music and poetry as motivating the members and giving them something to coalesce around. And included in the volume was his most memorable song, We Only Want the Earth. I put one verse of that up there. Some men faint-hearted ever seek our programme to retouch, and will insist whene'er they speak that we demand too much. 'Tis passing strange, yet I declare such statement is we nerve. For our demands most moderate are, we only want the earth. Also, I think there's the line to the guy I quoted at the start of this, who said that he was lacking mirth and lacking humour and was a miserable so-and-so. In March 1907, Connolly founded the Irish Socialist Federation in New York, and in 1908 launched a monthly journal, The Harp, aiming to win Irish-American workers over to socialism and the IWW, and to reject Home Rule in Ireland. His experience of US sectarianism, however, had led him to the conclusion that a broader socialist party was needed, with more tolerance for theoretical differences. And so in 1908 he joined the Socialist Party of America, which previously he criticised, but which had a vibrant left wing centred around Eugene Debs. The masthead of The Harp said, in things essential, unity; in things doubtful, liberty; in all things, charity. And that probably remained his watchword for the rest of his life. In July 1910, Connolly returned to Ireland. There's work to be done there, he said, that I can do better than anyone. And in the same year, he published his book, Labour in Irish History, which focused entirely on the relationship between the working class and the nationalist movement. A marvellous piece of socialist propaganda directed at the advanced nationalists with whom Connolly was later to fight in the 1916 Rising. Whereas most nationalists accepted the need for class unity, Connolly argued that it would never succeed. The Irish middle classes, he wrote, were tied by 1,000 economic strings in the shape of investments biting into English capitalism, and they feared their own people more than they hated the empire. Remember that quote on the title slide there. The nationalist movement, he said, was the idealised expression of middle-class interests, and he never believed that a national revolution could act as a substitute for a social revolution. Moreover, he had a totally unique view of what constituted a nation compared to the mainstream Irish nationalists. 16 days before the Easter Rising, he wrote, "We are out for Ireland for the Irish." But who are the Irish? Not the rat-renting, slum-owning landlord, not the sweating, profit-grinding capitalist, not the sleek and oily lawyer, not the prostitute pressman, the hired hand of the enemy. Not these are the Irish upon whom the future depends, not these but the Irish working class. The cause of Labour is the cause of Ireland, the cause of Ireland is the cause of Labour. And this book was the first powerful challenge to that mechanistic stages approach dominant in the Second International at the time. Kautsky and others saw the working class in the colonies as victims of oppression. They were not ready for socialism, and they should wait for socialists in the mother country to liberate them. They thought that the national question had to be settled first before the struggle for socialism could commence. For Connolly, however, the colonial working class should become the agents of their own liberation. Don't wait for the nationalist bourgeoisie to achieve independence, but replace them as the leaders of that struggle. And he returned to Ireland at what was the beginning of a very tumultuous 4 years. The Republican movement was advancing with a new organisation, Sinn Féin, based around the urban middle class and challenging the Home Rule Party. There would be a Home Rule crisis, sparked by an Orange backlash in Belfast, the Great Dublin Lockout of 1913, the threat of partition, and finally the outbreak of World War I. And in that context, he set about building the Socialist Party of Ireland. In May 1911, he went to Belfast as an organiser. He went to Belfast as an organiser for Jane Markin's Irish Transport and General Workers Union. Belfast was the most industrially developed city in Ireland, but it was also divided, often violently, along sectarian lines. The employers identified their interest with Britain and the Empire and consciously used the orange card to undermine class solidarity, linking Protestant employers with Protestant workers. The Union, however, developed out of a dock strike in 1907, where Protestants and Catholics had worked together and which challenged that notion. And the majority of socialists in Belfast were Protestants. Connolly therefore saw that as evidence that working class unity was possible. Then we have the Home Rule crisis. In 1912, Liberal Prime Minister Asquith needed the support of the Home Rule MPs in the British Parliament to pass his welfare budget and his bill to reduce the power of the House of Lords. And so he introduced the third Home Rule Bill. The Conservative Party backed the Unionist opposition, and in effect the Tory Party in 1912 preached sedition. They preached treason. Sir Edward Carson established the Ulster Unionist Council to resist Home Rule, and together with the Conservative Party leader Andrew Bonar Law, led a mass mobilisation of 100,000 Ulster volunteer militia through the streets of Belfast. In response, Republicans formed the Irish Volunteers. Connolly had no illusions in either Sinn Féin or the Home Rule Party, recognising that the advocates of freedom may be the most intensely conservative on the social and economic field. But he believed that socialists could not stay neutral on the issue. Home Rule would strike a blow at the British Empire, and he thought it would usher in an era of class politics as workers quickly realised that political independence had brought them little benefit. He was a great advocate of left unity. He believed that the development of a fighting spirit is of far more importance than the creation of a theoretically perfect organisation. And he believed in fighting on all fronts. He gave full support, for example, to the cooperative movement, to the Irish language movement, recognising that the suppression of native language was a means of exerting colonial control. We have to look no further than New Zealand to see another example of that. And seeing the language movement as one of defiant self-reliance. At the May 1912 conference of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, he put a resolution calling for the establishment of an Irish Labour Party. Along with all nationalists, he thought that Home Rule was a certainty. He thought that it was bound to happen. We've already seen a Liberal Prime Minister introducing a bill to that effect. But he failed to foresee the scale of opposition from Northern Irish capital or recognise the depth of Orange ideology within the Protestant working class. Belfast was gripped by reaction. Protestant workers driving Catholics and socialist workers from the docks and other workplaces and out of their homes. Dublin, however, experienced one of the greatest industrial upheavals of the first 2 decades of the century, the Great Dublin Lockout. At this time across Europe, from about 1907 through to 1913, countries are experiencing huge strike waves. It happened in Britain, it happened here in New Zealand with the Great Lockout of 1913 here in Wellington, and it certainly happened in Dublin. One of Dublin's wealthiest employers, William Martin Murphy, called Larkin the labour dictator of Dublin. and he led a coalition of 400 employers who agreed to lock out any employee who refused to resign their membership of the union. Even against these tremendous odds, Larkin and Connolly decided to fight, rather than avoid a battle and be defeated anyway. Dublin became militarised, with thousands of British troops supporting the police. Violent attacks on the strikers left 3 dead and hundreds injured, and Connolly was sentenced to 3 months in jail for sedition. He pointed out the hypocrisy of the government in tolerating the law-defying Ulster Unionists who are marching through the streets of Belfast with rifles opposing the Home Rule Bill, whilst pitting the full force of the state against striking workers. And in response he formed a workers' militia to defend their meetings. This is the origin of his Irish Citizens' Army. Seen here parading outside Liberty Hall, and the next one. And here we see their emblem, the Starry Plough, unveiled in April 1914, just before the outbreak of the First World War, and flown by the Irish Citizen Army during the Rising in 1916. The strikers were eventually forced back to work, many facing severe victimisation, but the union wasn't destroyed and would come again. And even in defeat, said Connolly, there were lessons to be learned. To the Dublin working class belongs the honour of making the sentiment of an injury to one is the concern of all, one that all labour organisations must henceforth be measured by. The opposition to his Home Rule Bill and a projected Curragh mutiny amongst the British Armed Forces in March 1914, and the arming of the Ulster Volunteer Force, that's the Protestant organisation, with 20,000 German guns, forced Prime Minister Asquith to retreat. And he allowed an amended bill which would allow the 6 northern counties to opt out. Partition. This, said Connolly, would lead to a carnival of reaction north and south. The position of northern nationalists within an orange state would be intolerable. Partition would destroy the unity of Irish labour and set back the struggle for socialism for a generation or more. And of course he was absolutely right. And then came the outbreak of the First World War, and Home Rule was postponed altogether, leading him to comment that yes, ruling by fooling is a great British art, with great Irish folk to practice on. It would be true to say that in 1914 Connolly was despairing and somewhat demoralised. The ITGWU, the union, was severely weakened, partition seemed on the cards, and the Irish Parliamentary Party led by Redmond supported the war and recruitment, believing it would guarantee them Home Rule after the war was over. The bulk of the 190,000 strong Irish volunteers were swayed by Redmond and rechristened the National Volunteers, and many of them joined up. Only 13,000 breaking away to remain as the Irish Volunteers. Connolly was disgusted. Alas that I should live to see it. North, south, east and west, the Irish Volunteers are marching and parading with the Union Jack in front of them, their bands playing God Save the Queen, God Save the King, and their aristocratic officers making loyalist speeches. And then to his utter despair, the betrayal of the socialist parties of the Second International, who only 6 months before war broke out were threatening a general strike if it did. In the event, on the declaration of war, socialist and labour parties across Europe supported their governments, only the Russian and Serbian parties refusing to do so. Connolly remained one of a handful who stayed as revolutionary socialist, along the likes of Lenin, John Maclean in Britain and Rosa Luxemburg in Germany, seeing the war as a capitalist move for new markets and new colonies. And whilst he supported attempts to alleviate the effects of war on working people, for him the key task now was to prepare for revolution. He quoted Wilhelm Liebknecht, another German socialist who stayed true to the cause, that socialists had only one enemy, the capitalist class, and those of their own country at the head of the list. Even an unsuccessful attempt at revolution by force of arms, said Connolly, would be less disastrous to the socialist cause than the act of socialists allowing themselves to be used in the slaughter of their brothers in the cause. And he hoped and argued that Ireland could set the torch to a European conflagration that would destroy capitalism. Britain, he said, was so overstretched by the war effort, now was the time to strike. Rebellion so close to home would be immensely psychologically damaging to the prestige of the world's most powerful empire. And he pointed out the hypocrisy of British claims to be concerned about the rights of small nations. Britain had claimed to go to war because German troops had marched into Little Belgium. Connolly said how hypocritical to do that and at the same time not be concerned about the rights of a small nation like Ireland. But of course the strategies of peacetime were no longer applicable, and he was forced to rethink, and in so doing make concessions to the type of republican conspiratorial militarism he had long counselled against. He now believed that what was needed was exemplary action to awaken the nation and the working class. But he only had the Irish Citizen Army, 200 or 300 strong at that time, even though it contained many of the most committed and radical activists in Ireland. He saw it as a revolutionary vanguard, a visible alternative to the Republicans who had split from Redmond and the Home Rule Party. But he was forced to work with them because of the size of his own forces. Just a little note here on the Irish Volunteers to make sense of what's going to follow. The movement was composed of two strands: the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which favoured an uprising during the war, and a more right-wing group around Earl McNeill and Bulmer Hobson, who wanted to preserve it as a fighting force until the end of the war, and then pressure what they thought would be a weakened empire and a weakened Britain into granting full home rule. The threat of conscription in 1916 gave a new lease of life to the revolutionaries, and the Irish Volunteers began to grow in numbers. Police reports at that time confirmed that many of the Redmondite party, those who had supported the war and had come to join it, would support insurrection if conscription was introduced. And so when conscription was introduced in Great Britain in 1916, Ireland was excluded. Connolly, encouraged by the influx of members, renewed his calls for the rising, and he agitated openly for one. The IRB, however, disliked his open agitation, fearing it was highly dangerous to their plans. As fellow insurrectionist Patrick Pearse said, he will never be satisfied until he goads us into action, and then he will think most of us are too moderate and want to guillotine half of us. Sean O'Kelly of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, on the other hand, wrote that if it wasn't for James Connolly, the rising would never have occurred when it did. The rising was planned for Easter Sunday 1916. The plan was to land 20,000 rifles from a German ship and transport them by train to 16,000 volunteers mobilised across Ireland, seize control of strategic buildings and positions in major cities, to stretch the army and the Royal Ulster Constabulary and overwhelm them. And on one thing we need to be very clear. This has sometimes been portrayed as the sort of mythical blood sacrifice, that these men went out deliberately to die in the hope that their martyrdom would inspire others to follow. The strategy was actually premised on a very real chance of success. There were only 6,000 British troops in Ireland at that time, supported by some 9,000 not entirely reliable police. The conspirators hoped that the uprising would spark a response from those sick of the war and against partition. They could establish a provisional government which could claim a place at the peace table at the end of the war. Connolly, of course, also hoped it would spark a European-wide uprising against imperialism and capitalism. And he told his Irish Citizen Army members that in the event of victory they should hold on to their rifles, as those with whom we are fighting may stop before our goal is reached. Two events struck a fatal blow to these plans. The first was the scuttling of the ship transporting the German weapons. The second was a consequence of the conspiratorial methods of the IRB, who had operated secretly within the volunteers and kept their plans for a rising hidden from McNeill and Hobson. Connolly had warned against this, saying they should have deposed the leadership before planning the rising. McNeill discovered the plans and called off the mobilisation of the volunteers on Easter Sunday. And it became clear to Connolly, Pearse and others that the British authorities had now had sufficient evidence to arrest the leaders and probably execute them. They therefore decided to go ahead on Easter Monday with the forces that they could muster. For Connolly, a defeated rising was preferable to no attempt at all. I missed a few slides, keep going. Yeah. So there's the Declaration of Independence that was posted on the GPO in Dublin on Easter Monday 1916. In the end, some 1,500 rebels took arms against the British Empire, and they held out for 6 days. 82 of them were killed. And many more wounded. But they inflicted far more damage to the British Army than previous rebellions. 116 British soldiers dying and 370 wounded. The scale of civilian casualties caused by the British bombardment of Dublin city centre led them eventually to surrender. But one military expert has commented that they performed as well as, if not better, than a fully trained professional force. And one little known fact that I came across totally accidentally is that 5 New Zealand soldiers who had been given leave from the Western Front and visited Dublin when the rising broke out were recruited by the authorities to help defend Dublin Castle. And these 5 New Zealand soldiers later proudly proclaimed that they had killed 27 rebels by themselves. I would like to discuss in more detail than I've got time to do the role of women in the uprising, because it's been sadly underreported and it's a very interesting story, but I haven't got the time to tell that in detail here. Women fought alongside the men and in some cases commanded their male comrades, and this can be attributed directly to the influence of James Connolly, who had always supported the cause of women's independence and women's suffrage, and as one of them, Margaret Skinner, they later said, "We have the same right to risk our lives as the men, that in the Constitution of the Irish Republic, women were on an equality with men. For the first time in history, a constitution had been written that incorporated the principle of equal suffrage." So just a few slides of women here, just to show you how many, well, not show you how many were actually involved, but it certainly shows some of those who, get back to the first one. Next one. Yeah, that's the most famous one, probably a name that many people might recognise. Countess Constance Markievicz, who designed the Irish Citizen Army uniform, and she composed its anthem. She was actually sentenced to death for her part in the rising, but was reprieved because of her gender. So it's a sort of ironic twist, the fact that they were proud to be allowed to fight alongside the men like Connolly, and it was the fact that she was a woman that allowed her to escape the death penalty. First woman elected to the British Parliament, and the first Irish female cabinet minister, and the only one prior to 1979. Yeah. I'm just going to go through these now, but all of these women fought alongside the rebels in 1916. This is an interesting slide because this is Patrick Pearse surrendering to the British Army at the end of the Rising. There you see a pair of wooden shoes on the bottom of a skirt, and Elizabeth O'Farrell actually accompanied Pearse to the surrender, having fought alongside him during the Rising. But you wouldn't know that from that photograph, and it's very rarely mentioned in any of the histories of the Rising. The other thing about all those women, every single one of those that I've shown you there, is that when Civil War broke out after the partition of Ireland, and after the Michael Collins-led Nationalist government accepted the partition of Ireland, all of those women, every single one of them, fought on the side of the anti-treaty forces. They were all on the side of those fighting for the full 32-county Irish Republic. One of them, just go back and get another one. Another one. Go back the other way. There we are. Margaret Skinner here, a maths teacher, severely wounded 3 times during the conflict, remained an ardent nationalist for the rest of her life. And if you look at the police records of some of these women, I mean, you wouldn't think, look at that nice private math teacher there, would you? She was pretty fierce. She was a sniper on the roof. I can't remember which building she was on now. Biscuit factory, I think. And she fought fiercely alongside the other woman there on the right, and Nora O'Keefe. So, I could do a whole talk about them probably, as I said, I haven't got the time, but I do find it hugely interesting. Connolly himself, go back through now. There we go. Connolly himself, seen here in this painting by Walter Paget, was badly wounded. So there's Connolly on the stretcher there, one of those sort of iconic images. And the aftermath of the rebellion saw a ferocious repression by the British state. So just to give you some clue of the scale of the damage in Dublin city centre, and that's prisoners being marched off to jail there, and this is the forecourt of Dublin Castle where even 14 rebel leaders were court-martialed in secret without due process, and 14 of them were executed. British generals considered Connolly the worst of the lot. But the fact that he was already badly injured and unlikely to recover led to some cause for his reprieve. But the Irish elite, led by William Martin Murphy, the Dublin industrialist who I've already mentioned, were adamant that he should die. Let the worst of the ringleaders be singled out, said Murphy, and dealt with as they deserve. Connolly regretted nothing. In his statement to the court-martial, smuggled out of jail by his wife Lily, he said, "We succeeded in proving that Irishmen are ready to die endeavouring to win for Ireland these national rights which the British government has been asking them to die to win for Belgians." That's the first clip, if you could play that. So this is obviously not Connolly himself talking, but this is the text of his speech that his wife smuggled out of jail.
Stand by.
Has the technology let us down again?
That's right.
Apologies. Okay, looks like I'm going to have to do without sound, which means I can't play you some nice Irish tunes. I can get rid of it, which is a shame. They were working before we started.
Than any coalition that ended during that World War or having any connection with the war. We succeeded in proving that Irish...
You want to select that?
Oh, okay.
This being a reading of the last statement of James Connolly, I quote, "To the Field General Court-Martial held at Dublin Castle, May 9, 1916, we went out to break the connection between this country and the British Empire and to establish an Irish Republic. We believe the call we then issued to the people of Ireland was a nobler call and a holier cause than any coalition that ended during that World War or having any connection with the war. We succeeded in proving that Irishmen are ready to die, endeavouring to win for Ireland those national rights which the British government has been asking them to die to win for Belgium. As long as that remains the case, the cause of Irish freedom is safe. Believing that the British government has no right in Ireland, never had any right in Ireland, and never can
12th of May 1916, unable to walk and strapped to a chair, James Connolly was executed at Kilmainham Jail.
America this week refused to condemn.
And I want to play you the first of those ballads, or a clip from the first of those ballads that I mentioned earlier on. The ballad which proclaims Connolly as the man wrapped to the green flag, the Irish nationalist, the heroic, romantic figure, and a rather sentimentalised sort of commemoration of him by a band that you've probably heard of, many of you, the Wolf Tones. So if we can just play a little bit of that one.
And I was picked to kill a man like that. James Connolly. A great crowd had gathered outside of Kilmainham, their heads all uncovered, they knelt to the ground. For inside that grim prison lay a brave Irish soldier, his life for his country about to lay down. He went to his death like a true son of Ireland, the firing party he bravely did face, and the all rang out.
I think you get the general feel of what that version of the Connolly myth is all about. How did the socialist movement react? The British Socialist Party thought it was foolish. George Lansbury said it was a crime against the British people. The ILP said the psychology of it was a mystery to them. John Leslie described it as mad, bad and sad. Sylvia Pankhurst was almost the only British socialist to support him. In Europe, the likes of Bukharin and Radek described the rising as a putsch, and that it was premature, and that such a minimum demand should not have been raised during the Imperial War. Lenin, however, rejected that idea and vindicated Connolly's general strategy of fighting alongside Republicans. What cannot be denied is that the 1916 Rising was the prelude to one of the first successful nationalist revolts against the British Empire. The heroism of the rebels, the execution of their leaders, Connolly in particular, the imposition of martial law in Dublin, and increasing disgust at the European war brought about a very quick mood change. And again. And again. These slides are all over the place. I don't know where we've gone now. Right, okay.
We're going.
That's filming. Yeah, that's it, yeah. So, a year after Connolly's execution, here's the crowds out celebrating the first anniversary of that rebellion. And notice the sign on the building there, James Connolly murdered May 12, 1916. So the mood quickly changed. Sinn Féin triumphed in the 1918 general election in December and proclaimed an independent Irish Parliament in January 19. And for a brief moment it seemed that Connolly's legacy seemed secure. The draft programme of the Irish Republic asserted the right of the Irish people to the ownership of Ireland and the right of every citizen to an adequate share of the nation's labour, a general and lasting improvement in the conditions under which the working classes live and labour, the principles of liberty, equality and justice for all, with a view to the control and administration of industries by the workers engaged in those industries. The period from 1918 to 23 was one of unprecedented militancy amongst Irish workers, which has been downplayed by historians who've concentrated on the IRA's guerrilla war. 10,000 demonstrated in Dublin in support of the revolution. There was a general strike in Belfast at the beginning of 1919 and another in April 1920. 8 Soviets were established in Ireland before 1921. The most famous of which is this one at Limerick. Transport workers refused to move British troops or equipment, and as Connolly had envisioned, an increasingly radicalised working class was demanding both independence and social reform. As you all know, I'm sure, a truce was called in July 1921 and Ireland was partitioned. But by then, Connolly's specifically socialist message had become marginalised, and it became a very conservative revolution indeed. In Peter O'Donnell's words, Connolly's chair was left vacant, partly because the Labour Party hid the red flag behind the green, did not take part in the 1918 election, hoping that they would consolidate a place for trade unions in a new independent Ireland. And the Irish elite and the church, with the support of the British state, crushed the opponents of partition in the Civil War. As Connolly had warned, the green flag flew over Dublin Castle. As Connolly had warned, Northern Unionists consolidated their power in a sectarian state. And after his death, the Irish bourgeoisie faced the acute embarrassment of having a self-proclaimed Marxist amongst the heroes of the 1916 Rising, and they sought therefore to reclaim him for the Catholic and nationalist tradition. In Sean Harkin's word, he has been sanitised by Ireland's rulers, martyrised by Irish nationalists, and blessed wholly by the Catholic Church. Conservative union leaders idolise him, even though he would have raised against them in his day. Various socialist groups in hindsight have tried to criticise him for his supposed theoretical failings. But to judge him with hindsight is pointless. We must place him in context. The Ireland of the late 19th and early 20th century was a particularly unfavourable environment in which to organise. The Irish working class was amongst the weakest in Europe, and he had to contend with issues of land, culture and religion, and to contend with a pervasive and conservative nationalist tradition allied to the Catholic Church, plus a sectarian divide north and south. His political and strategic emphasis had to shift in response to the real questions of the day. If we place him in the context of Second International Socialism, he was far ahead of the other socialists of his day, particularly in his analysis of imperialism and his view that anti-colonialism could form the basis of a socialist strategy. He was totally against state capitalism, arguing that there could be no socialism without workers' democracy. He was totally against the notion that capitalism could be reformed out of existence. He was one of the very few to oppose the First World War, and is the only socialist in the British Isles ever to attempt a revolution. So we're going to finish. Just show the last few slides if you will. Just to give some idea from those murals on the walls in Belfast and from some of the statues that have been erected, that is still very much a living memory in Ireland. I'm going to finish with, I'm going to have a 5-minute break, you get a drink or whatever, I'm just going to play a bit of music while you do. First of all, Damien Dempsey, Irish singer and socialist, speaking at a rally to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Dublin Rising, and then singing his song to commemorate Connolly. And then finally, the Dropkick Murphys, a very different tribute to James Connolly. So take about 5 to 10 minutes, and then I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you. Okay, if anybody has got any questions or any comments or any contributions they'd like to make, happy to take them. And if all I'm met with is deathly silence, then I'll go and sit down again.
Yeah, before we do get into questions, sorry, Angus has had to take his daughter home. We've got to at least give our speaker a gift. There's this tradition. So we've got Toby Borman, who's another comrade who's spoken with us before. Is a member, I believe. His book, Rebel Rousers, which is about anarchists in New Zealand, and a bottle of wine.
Toby.
Yep.
You can't read into a book and having a drink of wine at the same time. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, and so just another round of applause for Martin for his excellent talk. And I think just given the, we're getting on a little bit now, we might try and keep it just perhaps to 2 or 3 questions, Martin.
I apologise, I did speak longer than I was asked to do. I apologise. Right, somebody had their hand up anyway. No. Go on then.
Well, in your view, how do you think he linked the sort of particular view of socialism in Ireland with socialism as a universalist and internationalist ideology?
I think in one sense that's very straightforward to answer. He thought, and I think I said that he thought that an uprising in Ireland would spark uprisings elsewhere in the empire, India for example, and some of the African colonies, which of course is what many socialists have thought, that it takes a spark in one place, if you like, to light the fire of revolution elsewhere. That once and particularly if you have a successful uprising against the British Empire, that would make all things possible. And of course, post-Second World War, it did. So I think there was that. I think what the challenge conventional Marxism at the time, which this stages theory that I talked about, that first of all you've got to have a middle class revolution if you want, you've got to have the landowners and the feudal lords dispossessed, you've got to have the development of industry and the development of a mass working class, and then, and only then, can we think about. And he said, no, we don't have to sit around and wait for that. We can organise now. And he tried to link the Irish working class in America and in Britain and in Ireland, to try and get that message across to them as well. So I think he was very much an internationalist, but he was also a very impatient socialist, and he saw conditions in Ireland as possibly quite unique in that there is this long-standing tradition of fighting for independence. Okay, they failed in 1798 and 18, I can't remember all the dates, but there have been plenty of them. And so I think he thought Ireland had a unique opportunity, particularly with the war. And like I said, there was this notion of that they somehow went out to sacrifice themselves in the hope that it would inspire future generations. Just not true. The British army was stretched. It was being massacred on the Western Front. They had very few troops to spare for Ireland. And if the uprising hadn't been called off by McNeill and Hobson, there would have been something like 20,000 volunteers, and if the guns they were expecting had arrived, it could have been a very different situation indeed. So, there's no doubt he was an internationalist, but he saw Ireland as being the spark that could really ignite the fire. Of course, a year later, it happened in Russia, and everything that followed from that.
Yeah. You made a few references to New Zealand during your talk, and I was just wondering, with a lot of sort of like the colonial or like national liberation struggles going on right here, but also with Palestine and flows internationally, would you say there is a difference between James Connolly's view of nationalism and socialism and sort of the view of the modern left, and what lessons could we learn from James Connolly?
A difference for the modern left. Well, yes, there is, because he was, and somebody speaking to me just, but they've gone now, he was way ahead of his time in terms of the socialist movement at that time, in linking the national liberation struggles with the struggle for socialism. Later, of course, we've had people like C.L.R. James, Fritz Fanon, Che Guevara, and others who have made that same link, but they were 50 years later. He was way ahead of his time. New Zealand is... I hesitate to comment too much because, as you can probably tell, I'm not from here, and I always hesitate to comment on things when there are people better placed to do so. But the Maori struggles had ended by and large in the mid to late 19th century. The land wars and everything else, they had basically been defeated. I did mention, however, how the British, the New Zealand government tried to expunge the Maori language, so that sort of colonial legacy continued, and of course Maori remained the economic underclass, and still does. There was an attempt pre-First World War, this I do know, through the Maori Land Worker and the IWW and others, to try and enlist the Maori in the socialist struggle, because a lot of those early Maori struggles in the 19th century against the British expropriators, if you like, was based on without being explicitly expressed, was a very socialist basis. I mean, they were a much more communal society than white colonialists, you know, much more communal in terms of the way they organised their villages and their communities. And there was an attempt to enlist Maori much more significantly, as I said, through the IWW, through the New Zealand Socialist Party, and through the Maori Land Worker in particular. Later, in the 70s, I think, but please don't, Maori were very much to the forefront of industrial struggles and trade unionism and strikes, you know. But the socialist movement in this country, after the First World War, has been very small. I mean, even the Communist Party, in its heyday, had a couple of hundred members, you know, and there's been no socialist organisation in this country to compare with, say, the Socialist Party pre-First World War, or the IWW and everything there. And that is one of the things we grapple with. We, when I say we, Canterbury Socialist Society, I wrote out to all socialist organisations in New Zealand, all of whom are very tiny, many of whom are almost invisible in the national, saying, quoting Lenin, what is to be done, and said, please write to Commonweal and tell us what you think socialists should be doing in New Zealand in the 21st century. And if you remember, you'll get that online in the next, certainly by the end of this month. I've just published them with no comment as a special issue of Commonweal online. I'm very clear in Canterbury, although Canterbury obviously is very different to the North Island, that we need to try and make links with not just Maori, but with Asian and Pacifica workers, and try and get them involved in the movement. Because without that, we're going to struggle. But to go back to your original question, yeah, there was an attempt, a determined attempt pre-First World War, little since that I am aware of, but it's noticeable that in the great industrial struggles of the 70s, Maori were prominent. Yeah, if there's any historians in the room who can help me out with that, I'd be grateful. As I said, I think for me, Connolly is an inspiration. He is the only British socialist to actually try to start a revolution. I mean, you know, we sit and we talk about it, and people have sat and they've talked about it, and but he's the only one that actually tried. And there's no doubt about the fact he was an inspirational figure. Just read any of the testimonies from the people who fought alongside him. An inspirational man, and I think he's still, to this day, got a lot to say to us in terms of what socialists should be doing and how we should organise. Anyone?
Will these slides be available somehow? I'd love to know more about those women who didn't pay that time to get into the financial.
Sure. Can you send the slide? If you... Well, you can send them out to as many people as you want, but yeah, there have been one or two things written about them lately, but for a long time they were, well, Catholic Ireland, you know, women weren't supposed to be fighting and shooting and killing, and so they were literally written from history. The other thing is, all the slides there where I put two women side by side, as one historian recently has noticed, Irish lesbians were hiding in plain sight. And they could in those days because it was quite normal for unmarried women to live together in Catholic Ireland. And Catholic Ireland didn't think that there would be anything untoward about that. Since then, of course, we've discovered that many of them were in single-sex, same-sex relationships, and they fought alongside each other in 1916. An inspirational story. And somebody like Margaret Skinner, who I particularly singled out, you know, very, very brave. Yeah, so yes, by all means, yeah, you can always share the slides out here.
Just to add to that, the Irish History Podcast had a 10-part episode series on Irish women in the War of
Can you
Independence.
speak up? Can't hear you up here.
There was a podcast series by the Irish History Podcast of women in the Irish Revolution in 10 parts. Just Google Irish History Podcast by Finn Dwyer. You should find them. They're really, really good.
Thanks for that, because I didn't know that either, so I'll look them up as well. Thank you.
Yeah, we're recording this this talk and we'll upload it to YouTube and Substack, so you can kind of get the slides indirectly. But we can also share them to our mailing list via email as well. Okay, so I think in the interests of kind of not letting things run on too much, we will conclude proceedings tonight now. I would remind anyone who wants to join our mailing list, you can do both of those things. There's a sign-up sheet just at the bar there, and there's still some Commonwealths for sale as well. There's a jar for a Koha donation for the Commonwealth purchase. But yeah, just another round of applause for Martin for coming up to Christchurch.
Sorry, just one more thing. I am the editor of Commonweal. The next edition is due out May Day. Deadline for submissions end of this month. It's a journal for members to write. It's not a sort of academic journal for professional historians or politicians or anything like that. So please, any members that have got something interesting to write about, do get in touch and let's get some contributions in the next Commonweal. Thank you.